Imagine standing in a crowded marketplace, surrounded by families, laughter, and music, when suddenly, one hateful voice cuts through the air. A woman points at a black man and shouts, "Go back to Africa!" The entire crowd freezes. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. His response didn't just silence her, it left the entire marketplace speechless. Stay with me, because this story will give you chills. It all began on a warm Saturday afternoon in the middle of a crowded farmer's market. The sun hung high in the sky, spilling golden light over the colorful stalls. The air was buzzing with life, the voices of vendors shouting out their best deals, the laughter of children chasing each other between tables, and the aroma of freshly baked bread drifting through the streets. Shoppers strolled leisurely, carrying bags filled with fruits, vegetables, and flowers, soaking in the joy of the weekend. Among them was David, a tall black man in his 30s. He stood out not because of his skin color, but because of his calm and composed presence. He was well-dressed, his shirt neatly tucked in, and a book tucked under his arm, a man who clearly valued both knowledge and character. People who knew David would describe him as kind-hearted, the type of person who would help, carry groceries for an elderly woman, or offer his umbrella to a stranger in the rain. That afternoon, David wandered peacefully through the market, stopping every so often to admire the produce, exchange smiles with the vendors, or greet familiar faces. But as he reached a fruit stand and picked up a few red apples, something unexpected cut through the warm, cheerful atmosphere. A harsh voice rang out, loud, sharp, and dripping with anger. "You don't belong here. Why don't you go back to Africa?" The words came from a woman in her 50s. She had sharp features, narrowed eyes, and a permanent scowl etched across her face. Her voice sliced through the laughter, through the chatter, and froze the moment in place. In an instant, the market fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children stopped playing. Bags of fruit hung in motionless hands as people turned to see what had just happened. Every eye shifted toward David. Some were filled with shock, others with disbelief, and a few with anger. Nobody had expected to hear such open hatred in a place meant for community and connection. The woman stood tall with her arms crossed, her chin lifted as if she had proven some kind of point. She sneered, waiting for David to react. It wasn't just an insult, it was a challenge, a dare. The air felt heavy, the tension almost visible, as everyone waited to see what David would do next. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that made every heartbeat sound louder, every breath feel sharp. No one could quite believe what they had just heard. This was a farmer's market, a place where people came to relax, shop, and enjoy simple pleasures. And yet in the middle of laughter and sunshine, hatred had suddenly been poured into the open. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding them from the ugliness of the words. Some gasped in shock, their hands flying to their mouths. A few shook their heads in disgust, unable to comprehend why someone would spew such venom in public. Others leaned toward one another, whispering nervously, as though trying to make sense of what had just happened. And then there was David. He didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He didn't even drop his calm expression. He simply stood still, tall and composed. His presence so steady that it unsettled the angry woman. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. A pause that carried more weight than words ever could. His eyes swept across the crowd. He noticed the wide-eyed stares, the worried faces, the unspoken question written on everyone's expressions. What is he going to do? David knew he had choices. He could have shouted back, meeting fire with fire. He could have walked away, leaving the insult hanging in the air unanswered. He could have let anger take control. But David had learned long ago that anger is a thief. It steals clarity, dignity, and power. He remembered something his grandmother once told him. When people throw hate at you, don't throw it back. Show them you are bigger than the hate. So, with deliberate calm, David set down the apples he was holding, as if to free himself for something more important. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and took a slow step toward the woman. The woman smirked at his movement, mistaking it for intimidation. "What?" she snapped, her voice dripping with arrogance. "Don't you understand English? I said go back!" A ripple of discomfort ran through the crowd. Some people shifted, clearly ready to intervene, but before anyone could act, David raised his hand gently. His gesture wasn't aggressive, it was commanding. a signal that he didn't need protection. The crowd stilled again. All eyes were locked on him, waiting for the words that would finally break the silence. David's voice was calm, but it carried like thunder across the marketplace. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. It demanded attention. Through its strength alone. "You tell me to go back to Africa," he began, his eyes fixed firmly on the woman. "But do you know what you're really saying? You're not just insulting me, you're insulting every struggle, every sacrifice, and every contribution that people like me have made to this country." The woman's smirk, which only moments earlier seemed so sure of itself, began to falter. But David didn't stop. His words came steady, unshaken, as though they had been waiting years to be spoken aloud. "My ancestors," he said, pausing as if to let the weight of his words settle in the air, "were taken from their homes against their will. They were shackled, chained, and forced onto ships across oceans. They were bought and sold like objects, stripped of their names, their families, and their dignity. They were beaten, worked to death, and denied even the simplest recognition of their humanity." The crowd listened in stunned silence. Some nodded slowly, others shifted uncomfortably, but every ear stayed locked on David's voice. "And yet," David continued, his tone rising with quiet strength, "despite centuries of pain and cruelty, my people built. We tilled these fields. We harvested the crops that fed millions. We laid down the tracks of the railroads that connected this country from east to west. We fought in wars that weren't even for our freedom, risking our lives so this country could call itself strong and free. We raised families in the face of injustice. We created music that still moves hearts today. We invented tools, medicines, and machines that shaped modern life. We gave this nation some of its greatest leaders, athletes, artists, and thinkers." At this point, the marketplace seemed frozen in time. David's words weren't just directed at the woman anymore. They were echoing into the ears of everyone present. "So when you tell me to go back," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving hers, "you erase all of that history. You erase the blood, the sweat, and the tears that are stitched into the very fabric of this nation. My roots are here, just as much as yours, because my blood, my family, and my work are woven into the foundation of this country." The crowd hung on to every word, realizing they weren't just witnessing a response. They were witnessing truth that could no longer be ignored. The woman's face turned crimson, her earlier confidence collapsing under the weight of David's words. Her eyes darted around, desperate for support. But the crowd that had once been silent was no longer on her side. Where she expected agreement, she found only judgment. Where she looked for allies, she saw people shaking their heads in disapproval. Some in the crowd nodded firmly, as though David had spoken the thoughts they had always felt but never voiced. Others began clapping softly, their applause hesitant at first, but quickly growing louder. A few wiped away tears, moved by the raw truth he had laid bare. What had started as one man defending his dignity was turning into something much greater, a moment of unity, a lesson unfolding before everyone's eyes. But David wasn't finished. His calm gaze remained fixed on the woman. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady yet piercing, every word striking like a hammer. "Tell me," he asked, "where should I go back to? Because the last time I checked, I was born right here, in this city, in this country. This is my home. And nothing you say, nothing you shout can take that away." The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat. Then, like a wave breaking against the shore, the marketplace erupted into sound. Applause thundered through the stalls. Shoppers who had frozen in shock moments earlier now clapped with pride. Vendors stepped out from behind their tables, joining in the ovation. Children grinned and pointed, their eyes wide as if they were watching a superhero stand tall against a villain. Even those who usually avoided conflict couldn't hold back their admiration. The woman's power crumbled. What had begun as her attempt to humiliate David had backfired in the most public way possible. Her cheeks burned, her lips pressed into a tight line, and her hands shook slightly as she realized the truth. She was alone. Muttering something under her breath, she turned sharply and pushed through the crowd. But this time, the sea of people that had parted for her earlier didn't move. They stood firm, forcing her to shove her way past. Every step she took away from the market felt smaller, weaker, until she finally disappeared from sight. All eyes turned back to David. He didn't gloat. He didn't bask in the victory. Instead, he offered a quiet smile, picked up the apples he had set down earlier, and placed them gently into his bag as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And yet, everyone knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. What happened that day didn't stay at the farmer's market. Within hours, it had spread far beyond those busy stalls. People who had been there pulled out their phones, their hands trembling with excitement, and uploaded the footage online. By evening, the video had already made its way across every social media platform. Millions watched as David stood tall against hate with nothing but calm, steady truth. Comments poured in by the thousands. Strangers from around the world praised his courage, his composure, and most of all, his wisdom. People wrote things like, "This gave me chills," and "This man is a true example of strength." Others shared the video with messages to their friends and families, saying, "Watch this. This is how you handle hate." But David himself never once claimed to be a hero. To him, it was never about the applause or the spotlight. When a local reporter stopped him the next day and asked, "How did you stay so calm when faced with so much hate?" David didn't give a long speech or try to paint himself as anything extraordinary. He simply smiled and said, "Hate is loud, but truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be spoken." Those words alone became a quote that people repeated, shared, and remembered. They were simple, but they carried a weight that no amount of shouting could drown out. The farmer's market, in the days that followed, returned to its usual cheer. Vendors called out their specials. Children laughed as they chased each other, and neighbors exchanged smiles while filling their bags with fresh fruit. Yet something lingered in the air, a lesson, a memory, like a fragrance that refused to fade. People didn't just walk away with apples, bread, or flowers that day. They walked away with a story that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Because in a single moment, David had reminded everyone watching that dignity is stronger than insult, that truth is louder than lies, and that belonging is never determined by the color of your skin. And so what began as an attempt to tear one man down instead became a powerful reminder to all. When you are faced with hate, the greatest response is not rage, but a voice of unshakable strength that leaves the world speechless. And that day, David proved that dignity will always be stronger than hate. His words didn't just silence one woman, they inspired an entire crowd. And now millions around the world. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Together, let's spread truth louder than hate.